Welcome back. Central edition of the trade deadline analysis. This is part 3 of 4. Last one up is Pacific. Again, season's not halfway over. Take this with a grain of salt. It's still early, but again, we saw trades begin around this time last year. Trade deadline seems to be starting earlier, year in and year out. So it's good to talk about this now, kind of where teams are at. Remember, green is buyers, red is sellers. Some of this is going to warrant explanation, so bear with me. Starting off with the Winnipeg Jets. Dude, honestly, I think they need a second-line center. Unless Velarde slots down when Kyle Connor is healthy. But at the same time, you don't have anyone that can really slide up into that second-line role. Currently, it's Nemestikov, who's fine as a third-line center or wing in Winnipeg. He's found his game in Winnipeg. I'm sure Winnipeg loves him. He loves Winnipeg. It's been a very good match. But he's on an expiring contract, so that could be a trade piece, especially with the showcasing, you could say, they're doing with him as the second-line center. He could hold some value on the trade market. They're also going to look for depth. They're a pretty solid team top to bottom, so I don't think they'll be overly active. I think they'll go out and acquire someone, and at most they acquire a big-name second line, probably a center. They also have Brendan Dillon and Dylan DeMello on expiring contracts at the end of this year, and that is what your DeMello is playing first-line minutes right now-ish, and he's playing first-line minutes, and Brendan Dillon is your second-liner. Both these guys, again, expiring contracts. If you're not going to be able to keep one of them, then you might as well trade them for nothing, but at the same time, we've seen teams keep these players as their own rentals and let them walk in free agency or trade their unrestricted free agent rights before the free agent market hits. We could very well see that. I personally don't see them trading either of those guys, but you never know. If the price is right, they may make a trade and may shore up their defense a little more with within that trade. I also have some restricted free agents here. Some of these guys aren't essentially living up to their potential, if you will. They're still young. They're still restricted free agents. There's still time. But we may see one of these players bundled in as some type of sweetener, being Logan Stanley, Chisholm, Gustafson, and Hinola. The Jets have picks they can also trade. So the question is, what are they going to trade? The biggest things I could see being traded is Nemestikov, a prospect, and a pick for a premier-ish player. So we'll see what the Jets do. Avalanche, second place. Again, this is by current standing, so first through fourth, 5 through 6. Avalanche, they're going to be looking for a 6th or 7th defenseman, as they should. A middle 6 forward, and probably a goalie, and we'll talk about that. The 6th and 7th defenseman, so currently their third-line pairing defenseman is Jack Johnson and Caleb Jones. Which is not great. It's not what you want as your third pairing for a Stanley Cup contender. It could be worse. They could have John Merrill of the Minnesota Wild over there, but they don't. Caleb Jones, his stats are decent, but realistically his play is definitely questionable in his own zone sometimes. He makes great plays. He shows very good flashes of he can be a top 4 defenseman, but at the same time he makes some rough plays in his own zone. And Jack Johnson, older defenseman, one of those number 6, number 7 guys in the league, both on expiring contracts, so we could see one of those players traded as well, along with Curtis McDermott, one of those bigger, could be an enforcer type guy for one of those teams. But in the past, we've seen McDermott stick with the Avalanche on an expiring contract for that very purpose, and we could see that yet again this year. So I'm not quite sure McDermott gets traded unless the price is right. What they could be giving up, picks. Most likely they're going to give up some picks. And a team that's aspiring to be in the Stanley Cup, your first-round pick is going to be a little less valuable than if you miss the playoffs. So we could see that pick go, that first-round overall pick. We could see the second as well. I don't know if the second, they still have their second. Kiravanta on an expiring contract. I'm not quite sure they trade Kiravanta. But nonetheless, I think if you're going to swap out some forwards, Kiravanta might be an appealing piece for certain teams. Cogliano, that's tough to say. Expiring contract. He's currently serving as your third-line center, and I think he's played pretty well in Colorado. I don't think their third line has particularly been the biggest issue. But shoring up that second line, getting that production from that second line will definitely help. Remember, they have Arturi Lehkonen on the IR right now. That'll help when he comes back. They also have Olofsson. Maybe they trade Olofsson if he can, maybe as a sweetener. And I put the goalie up here. Georgiev having a sub 900 save percentage season. God, I don't even. Franco's on the IR. So what do you do exactly? Do you make a move? Do you make a move just to make a move at the trade deadline? I don't think so, but if the goalie market is going to be hot, I think Colorado might take advantage of that. It's something to watch. Again, I don't think they'll pull the trigger on trading a goalie, but at the same time, you never know. If the price is right, the Avalanche will be looking to upgrade not just their forward group, but their defense as well. And if the cost comes at a goalie and you can afford it and pick up another goalie on the cheap, that'll do just as well as either Georgiev or whoever. That's also an option. Again, I don't really see that happening. That's it. Stars are pretty set. I really like their roster. Which is awful because I do not like the Stars. But, man, it's a good roster and a pretty likable team. Right now, I think they're kind of looking for defense. We'll talk about that. In their fourth line, not a whole lot of production there. Not a whole lot of, you either want a productive fourth line, speed or defense, or you want a grinder fourth line. They don't necessarily have an identity in my eyes. They work hard, and that is great. But you want something more from that fourth line that you're not quite getting. So they might go out and try to shore up that fourth line, along with some general depth. Again, veteran depth. They have some really key guys in the AHL that are looking fantastic that could be called up. But I don't know if playoffs will be the right time to do that. They might want to hold off on these guys until the beginning of next year. So we'll see with that. Players that could be traded. I got Craig Smith up here, an expiring contract, fourth line player. Prior 20 goal scorer. He works hard almost every shift for the most part. He could be somewhat of a trade piece. If you trade him for like a fourth or a fifth round pick, that could be an incentive, right? And you can bring up somebody else or go out and acquire a guy like Curtis McDermott from Colorado, for example. Probably won't happen, but just an example. Ryan Suter, too, I have on the board. He's 38. He has one more year left of his contract, but his age is catching up with him. I think if you're looking to upgrade any piece on this team, it's Ryan Suter. If you can trade him and get back maybe a top 4 defenseman or a top 6 defenseman, I think you did all right. Again, Suter slow. We kind of saw that in the playoffs a little last year. Every once in a while, he'd get beat. Still offensively intelligent. Like, he's still a useful NHL player, but definitely more suited for like a third line role now rather than a top 4 defense role. So we could see Suter on the trade block. That would be interesting. I don't think the Stars need to upgrade much, but if they do, again, I think it's Suter. Dellandrea, I don't think they trade Dellandrea, but he's on an expiring contract, and that could be one of those guys. Same with Scott Wedgwood. Wedgwood showing he can play solid NHL minutes. Probably not a starting goaltender, but if you're desperate for a goalie, Wedgwood could be an appealing option, especially depending on how Matt Murray, not the Matt Murray in Toronto and Ottawa and Pittsburgh, another Matt Murray, goaltender as well. He'll get I believe he's starting tonight, which is, what's today? Monday, January 8th, 2024. So if he comes in, plays well, gets a few more starts, continues to play well, it's very well we could see Scott Wedgwood on his way out, which is, I like Scott Wedgwood, but I hope he finds a good home if that happens. Predators, this is a weird one. Predators, always kind of a middling team, kind of on the fringe of making the playoffs, the wild card race every year. They tend to sell and they tend to buy at the same time, so I have both colors up. Who knows, especially Barry Trotz's first trade deadline, essentially, as general manager. We don't really know what to expect. They could buy, they could sell. I think I'd lean a little more towards selling, given their roster and their success and their recent history. But again, this is a team that historically both buys and sells at the deadline. They're looking for offense, a top 9 forward. They need more scoring. They need more offensive production, and they need a fourth line center. So they could go out and get one of those players, maybe like a Tomas Nosek from the New Jersey Devils, and probably futures, maybe picks. Expiring contracts / notables. Tyson Barrie, who has requested a trade. We'll see, $4.5 million cap hit. He's currently on the IR. His agent was given permission to talk to other teams about a potential trade. We'll see if anything comes to fruition from that. If it gets to that point where it's public and there's like the player's agent is talking to other teams, and weeks and a month goes by and you haven't heard anything on that rumor front, it's more likely than not then no team is really interested in taking on that cap hit, or the Predators don't want to retain any of that salary. Also, he's hurt. We don't know if this is a season-long thing or, because sometimes these injuries can turn into season-long injuries and so on. So there's a little lack of clarity with Tyson Barrie. But he's without a doubt on the trade block. Trenin, not quite living up to the expectations we thought he would. I had high hopes for him. I thought he was going to be a solid top 6 forward. That has not necessarily panned out. He's on an expiring contract. He's going to be a unrestricted free agent. It could be an appealing pickup for a team looking for offensive depth and maybe investing in this player that once had high potential. We see that every once in a while. Backup goalie Kevin Lankinen. Lankinen showing he can play pretty solid minutes and look good doing it. I like Lankinen, but you have UC Saros as your Vezina caliber goalie. You have a stud in Askarov coming up from the AHL. He's looked good whenever he's played in the NHL. So that kind of leaves Lankinen as maybe the odd man out, because you can't just keep Askarov in the AHL because you have 2 high-quality goalies. So Lankinen could be on the move. I also have Gurianov. I don't know if there's any interest in Gurianov. This is one I question putting on the board because, again, I don't know if any teams are actually interested in acquiring this player. But if they are, he is on an expiring contract. It could be one of those guys a team plops on the 4th line and hopes for production. But I think we're starting to see the end of Gurianov's career in the NHL for the most part. And I just got some random guys, right? Restricted free agents. I think they all are on expiring contracts. Will be restricted free agents this summer. This could be one of those sweetener deals. All 3 of these guys have played pretty well, though, so I'm not entirely sure how likely these players are to get traded. But again, we could see one of these players thrown in as a sweetener for whatever reason. Right? McCarron, Sherwood, and Cole Smith. Again, all have played pretty solid hockey so far. So we're moving on to the Blues. Blues, I think they gotta sell. I think you've seen the best of the Blues. I think you've seen the worst of the Blues. I think you kind of know what you got with this team. They're currently playing pretty well. I think they're 7-3 in their last 10. Like they look solid, but they're still several games out of the playoff race. Is there potential there to make the playoffs? And if there is, are they able to make a run in the playoffs? My answer would be, even if they make the playoffs, they're probably an easy first-round exit, especially if they're playing the Jets or the Avalanche, or like Vegas or even Vancouver potentially, depending on how the standings work out. Blues will be looking for a bottom 9 forward. I think their top line is fine. I know a lot of those players on that team have been underperforming this season, notably like Jordan Kyrou, right? You want to see him at or above a point per game, and he's not quite there. They could be looking for a second-line center. Is Braden Shen your second-line center? Personally, I think he can be, but I think he's a little more suited at this point. What he's shown this season as a 3rd C. His stats are pretty questionable this year, but he is the captain. I don't see him getting traded. They got Vrana, again, risky player, can score at an AHL level at an effective rate, but do we see a team take a risk on a guy like Vrana? Honestly, if any team is going to take a risk on Vrana, I could totally see it being the Boston Bruins. They like those risky guys. They got a solid locker room, but we'll see. I don't know. I have doubts that Vrana gets moved. Sammy Blais, depth guy. Oscar Sundqvist, again, a depth guy, can play that gritty grinder role if you need him to. Marco Scandella, I think, is interesting. I like Scandella a lot. He's played a lot of 3rd-line minutes. That could be an interesting trade piece to a team looking to upgrade their blue line. Perunovic, again, a younger defenseman, hasn't necessarily panned out at the NHL level yet. I think he's like 25-ish. And again, he's one of those players you see flashes that he can play very well, but at the same time, he can also be a a very defensive. I can't speak right now. He can be a liability in his own zone. That's what I'm trying to say. Excuse me. And Binnington. Do we see Binnington go? It's kind of clear that Binnington is either really hot or really cold, but it's getting to the point where it seems like there are some locker room issues in St. Louis. Is Binnington a part of that? And if so, are they able to dump off his contract? They're going to have to retain money for a trade for Binnington. He still has something like 3 years left after this year at a cap hit of $6 million. That's not an easy contract to move. You're going to have to retain money. But Binnington has value. He can go on hot streaks, and he can be lights out for 5-10 games at a time, and then he goes through streaks where he's Swiss cheese. He doesn't look good. So needs, again, top 4 defensemen. I think they need to upgrade their blue line in some way, shape, or form, and probably a goalie. Again, I love Hofer. I think Hofer's been great. He's one of my favorite players to watch in the league. I'm hoping it works out for Hofer, but at the same time, right? It's not necessarily fair to ask him to be the guy 82 games a year, and I don't even think you can with a guy like Binnington getting that salary in net as well. So trading Binnington might open things up for Hofer to potentially take a number 1 spot, or at least be in a competition with another goalie to potentially ease that locker room a bit. Again, speculation. I don't know about their locker room. I haven't read any reports or rumors, but just a feeling. Usually when almost the entire team is taking a step back in terms of stats, both offensively and defensively, typically it's a locker room thing. Typically it's not fun to go to the arena. It's not fun to see your teammates in practice and play games. It's more of a job. It's more of a chore. So we'll see with the Blues. I think they need to do some type of, at the very least, retool. We'll see. There's pieces there. So we're moving on to the Coyotes, though. This is where the Coyotes start ramping up. They're starting to build towards something. They're looking good. They're probably not going to make the playoffs this year, but they're probably going to finish in 5th or 6th, depending on how the rest of the season shapes up. They're going through a tough time right now. Minnesota will get healthy pieces back at some point. Potentially will pass them. May potentially pass the Blues. Right, so it's Coyotes, Blues potentially in 6th place, depending. And there's a lot of variables. Again, we're not even halfway through the season, so we're close to halfway through the season. But we'll get to Minnesota next. Coyotes, again, I think they're going to buy. I think they're going to make a bit of a splash, and they have not just the assets and the picks, but they have pieces to make a splash as well, which I think is really encouraging. I think they're going to look for a top 4 defenseman, maybe a veteran defenseman to be on that blue line that maybe plays a little more of a defensive style, and I think they're going to look for a 2C. Who is your 2C? Is it Logan Cooley? I don't even have this up right now. Who's currently playing wing? Currently having kind of a mixed season. Pretty solid offensively. Can be a little questionable defensively, but is potentially a franchise player. Right? Do you go out? Do you get a 2C, or do you kind of let your guys come up through the system? Do you be a little more patient? I think the 2C is a little on the back burner. We could see it, but I think their focus should be and will be getting a top 4 defenseman. Again, this is one of those teams where they're not expected to make the playoffs this year. There's not really that much of an expectation to make the playoffs next year as well. We could very much see them sell and get picks and get futures and continue to build up their system. They have a lot of guys coming up now and a lot of guys that are really talented. They still have a lot of prospects, right? They still have prospects like defenseman Dmitry Simashev. They got Danielle Boot, right? Those are just recent picks. So there's still more to come in Phoenix, Arizona. We'll see, but I think they're going to start buying. 7th place in the division, we got the Minnesota Wild. I think once these players get healthy, they'll be a solid team. They'll look like a playoff team. The question is, how far out is too far out at this point? They're pretty far out of the playoffs. So I don't know. I think they're going to buy, but buy very softly. I don't think they're going to go out and get a big name. I don't think they're going to sell off any big names. Not that they really have many big names to sell off. This is a team that really doubled down on their current roster. They extended all of these expiring contracts like Foligno and Zuccarello, Ryan Hartman, right? Some of these pieces that could really get you a haul at the trade deadline, maybe not a haul, but like, a guy like Ryan Hartman who can put up 20 goals and play anywhere in your lineup, play on the power play, play on the penalty kill if you need him to. He doesn't do that a whole lot. For his cap hit of $1.7 million, even if the Wild retain money, you can get a pretty decent haul back for that. So currently, I think they're looking for a third pairing defenseman. You can't have Merrill and Goligoski play on your third line. They're both, I don't know. You can kind of make a case for Goligoski, but at the same time, there are things that really just make you shake your head. Goligoski expiring contract, no movement clause. He's a Minnesota guy. I don't expect him to be moved or waive that no movement clause, which is fair. Merrill, we know there's no interest in John Merrill among NHL teams. If there's any move that's going to be made for John Merrill, they need to send him down to the AHL, which means he has to pass through waivers. And I don't think there's any appetite to bury money in the AHL with the ongoing buyouts of Parise and Suter. I think they're going to look for a middle six winger. Like, they're middle six wingers right now. Like, Johansson is a second-line player, right? Like, there's upgrades that can be had there. And Johansson's a very good player. But, there are players that, you can definitely upgrade around. I think they have plenty of versatile centers. So if you have, like, Rossi and Eric Sneck as your 1-2 center, I think that's fine. You have Freddie Gaudreau. You have Ryan Hartman. You have plenty of guys that can play centers. So I'm not too worried about that. But they might also trade for picks and futures. Notable guys that they could be moving. Again, there's not a whole lot because of those extensions they signed. Brandon Duhaime and Connor Dewar, restricted free agent. Duhaime's an unrestricted free agent. Both of these guys are excellent defensively, excellent fourth-line players with some upside, can play in the third-line roles if you need them to. Both of these guys are physical, can drop the gloves. They should have some appeal at the trade deadline. They also are currently showcasing Adam Raska, 22-year-old enforcer, essentially, who can skate, who can play. He's not going to give you offense. He'll give you a little bit of defense, but it's not going to be elite. Mostly an enforcer. Called up right now because you never know, a team looking for kind of a grittier depth forward. Raska could be a call. They also have Zach Bogosian on an expiring contract. I don't think they trade Zach Bogosian, but nonetheless, if the price is right, he's your guy. He's shown this year he can step into a top four role. I don't see Dakota Mermis getting traded. He's the captain of their AHL team, kind of that heart and soul guy of the AHL. He's played fine at the NHL level as a third pairing guy. I think he's too valuable as a depth defenseman to this organization that I don't think they'll trade him on an expiring contract. Goligoski, again, we just talked about him. No movement clause. I don't see him going anywhere, but he's on an expiring contract. This is one of those guys. They would like to move Goligoski. I don't know if that's actually doable. In futures and picks, they could trade, right? We've seen them trade their a couple seventh round picks to Tampa for Pat Maroon and Zach Bogosian. Moving on to the Blackhawks. Blackhawks probably going to sell, but it's tough because what do you sell? I'm sorry, I don't think I went through the Coyotes players you can sell. We're going to do this real quick. Coyotes, they got some guys they can sell off. You got Jason Zucker, you got Picks, you got Matt Dumba, who's had kind of a down year, probably not worth a whole lot, but could garner some appeal. I think Zucker will garner some appeal as well. Josh Brown, depth defenseman, we've seen him traded for in the past and kept as the 7th, 8th defenseman in Boston for their playoff run. Could see something similar to that. Troy Stetcher, Travis Dermott also on expiring contracts. Dermott, not the season you necessarily want to see from him, but serviceable third-line pairing defenseman, maybe a second-liner at most. Vejmelka as well. Again, they have goalies. You have Connor Ingram kind of established as your starting goalie. I totally thought my dog was eating plastic, so I was starting to panic. But he's not, thank God. Vejmelka, again, another year on, but if the goalie carousel begins, this is a key cog that could be traded to a team. Maybe he's given a chance to be a starter. Travis Boyd, expiring contract, we'll see. I don't know if Travis Boyd will be traded. Again, they have picks. They have a ton of picks. They have a ton of futures. So if they want to go out and make a splash, they have more than enough assets, probably the most assets of any team, to go out and make that splash and pay a lot. They can pay a lot and they'll still be all right. Not many teams can do that, and they have cap space. So they're looking to acquire a big name. They have cap space. They have the assets. They can do it. They can make it work. Blackhawks, again, they're looking for essentially everything. Top 6 forward, top 4D, picks, futures, anything. Notable players they could trade. Dickinson has looked decent as a top 6 forward this year. Spent some time on that first line. That's probably the most appealing piece I could see getting traded and getting somewhat of a decent return. It's not going to be outstanding, but you're going to get a return on Dickinson. Colin Blackwell, expiring contract. Nikita Zaitsev. Again, a team looking to shore up their blue line. A lot of defensemen available this trade deadline. Jared Tenorti, one of those 6th, 7th defensemen. Played well in Chicago. I think he's always played pretty well. But one of those guys that can be physical, can drop the gloves, will play defense first hockey. Reliable for the most part, but isn't going to give you any offense whatsoever. Jason Megna, again, depth guy. Peter Mrazek is an interesting one. Are the Blackhawks ready to give Soderblom the net? Like, is he ready to be a full-time, everyday type of starter? Because there's not a whole lot of other options. They'd have to get some type of other goalie back in exchange for Mrazek. So I don't know if they trade Mrazek, but he could have some value on that market. And if they trade Mrazek and get like a guy like I don't even know, like a backup goaltender, we'll say like a James Reimer and like a 6th round pick, you might want to make that trade because you're looking for picks and futures. I'm not saying that is a fair trade or a mock trade because I don't think Mrazek is going to Detroit. Tyler Johnson and Anthony Beauvillier, both on the IR, but both on expiring contracts. Both could garner some type of value, especially if salary is retained by Chicago. We could see that happen. But that's the Central Division. Let me know if I missed anyone. You have anyone that should be on this list. You see anyone going. You see anyone on this list that should be staying on their team. It's always interesting. I'm really intrigued to see what the Coyotes do, what the Blues do, and what the Predators do. I don't think we're going to see much from the Wild, and I think the other teams are either buying or selling. It's pretty clear cut. Obviously, some of these teams will need to wait closer to the trade deadline, which is in 2 months? I don't know what the official day is. A little less than 2 months, maybe. So there's still plenty of time. There's plenty of hockey to play to kind of see where you're going to be at potentially at the end of the season. More around the 50, 60 game mark. So that's all I got. I appreciate you watching. Take care, right?